Good afternoon and welcome to Kaufman Museum. I am Andy Schmidt-Andrus, the director here at Kaufman Museum. And before we begin, I have a few reminders and a few announcements. Very first reminder is that you should include Kaufman Museum on your list of spots to stop when you are shopping for Christmas. So right over there, our gift shop manager, Coralie Schenk, has been opening boxes and filling shelves. So be sure to stop by. All the proceeds from the store go to the museum operating budget. Second reminder, please visit the museum over the holidays. If you have special guests coming in from out of town, family members, or you just need a little respite, come on over. So we'd love to have you come visit. Our program this afternoon is part of a series that is being held in conjunction with our current special exhibition, Unlocking the Past, Immigrant Artifacts and the Stories They Tell. We have program schedules that look like this up at the front desk, and you can also look up any of the programs on the web. And there are two upcoming programs. The next two in line, I will tell you about December 1, which is just next Sunday. We'll be in the same spot at 3 o'clock. And that one's for the Deutsche Weihnachtenlieder. Oh, is Merle here? Did I get it right? It's Deutsche Weihnachtslieder. So that's next Sunday. And Bill Aish will be leading the songs. Karen Schlebaugh will be accompanying the songs on our Decknadel organ. And Merle Schlebaugh will be telling us about the different German Christmas carols that we'll be singing. And we will provide music, also be singing some standards that those that speak German probably are familiar with. The next program then that go with the Unlocking series is A Mennonite Sojourn in Central Asia, and that will be by John Sharp on January 12. So I said those two are specifically to go with the Unlocking exhibit. We do have some other programming coming up. National Museum Store Sunday is on December 1, so while you're here for Deutsche Weihnachtslieder, you can also take a moment to shop for Museum Store Sunday. December 7, we will have 5 Places of Christmas. That's in conjunction with 4 other cultural history organizations here in the North Newton area. December 8 at 3 o'clock, same spot. There will be a book reading, discussion, and book signing with David Jansen, author of the book Once Upon a Time, There Was a 3-Year-Old Grandpa. If you want to find out how that works, come on December 8. And then January 10, we're hosting a stargazing program with the Newton Public Library and Humanities Kansas, and that will be on our back lawn, so the west lawn of the museum, where there's less light pollution than at the library. And there is a free chapbook by Humanities Kansas that will go with that program that you can pick up when you attend. We do have a few at the front desk right now. And the last program I'll announce is, of course, the Newton Halstead Christmas Bird Count. That will be on December 14. Many of you know we just celebrated the 75th anniversary of the second longest running bird count in Kansas, and that will be at 6:40 a.m. We'll start here at Kaufman Museum. So this is the 76th year. Switching gears from the upcoming programs to our program today, I would like to begin by reading a land acknowledgement. We recognize that Kaufman Museum stands on the prairie where many original people hunted and farmed before the arrival of European and American settlers, particularly the Wichita, Kaw, and the Osage. As you visit Kaufman Museum's exhibitions and participate in the program today, we ask that you honor the contributions Native Americans have made to our nation's heritage and commit to respecting their descendants and learning about their rich cultural traditions. And today we will hear about some of those traditions from Dr. Eric Anderson and learn more about Kansas, before Europeans and Americans began moving into Central North America. Eric holds a doctorate in American history from the University of Kansas, specializing in American Indian cultures and the history of the United States West. He is an enrolled member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation and teaches at Haskell Indian Nations University in Lawrence. His major research focus is on American Indian education, especially the system of federal boarding schools established for Native youth in the late 19th century. He is currently working on a book about the history of Haskell Institute, as well as textbook projects in American Indian Studies and Native history. Please help me welcome Eric Anderson as he presents Diversity and Complexity in Indian Kansas.
Thank you. Andy, what a nice introduction. Thank you for inviting me over today. Wow, look at this group. This is amazing. It's a beautiful Sunday in November. What are you doing in here? I figured people would be hurriedly bringing in plants in advance of coming freeze or preparing for the holidays. Well, I'm really happy that you decided to come and spend some time here today and listen to me talk a little bit about Native people in this place that we call Kansas. I was here a while back, and in fact, I went to the building where I spoke at previously. I want to say 6 or 8 months ago. So it's really nice to come back to Bethel, to feel welcomed. I guess I must have done something right, because here I am again. The talk today is different. I talked about boarding schools, Native American boarding schools, last time I was here. And as Andy suggested, that's sort of my specialty, excuse me, but I am an historian. I am a citizen of a Native group that was here for a short period in Kansas. And I teach classes on natives in Kansas and Kansas history, so this is kind of in my wheelhouse too. And there we have Kansas as we think about it now. I was glad when I pulled this screen up today. I was like, oh my gosh, I hope Newton is on that map. And it is, so didn't want you to feel left out of all the other places there. Of course, Kansas today looks different than what it once did, and as Andy said, I'm going to talk to you somewhat about what that looked like before new people arrived, Europeans and their descendants and others as well. But I'm also going to bring it a little closer in time. So I didn't want to get into that and feel like, hey, he's really deviating from what she said he was going to talk about. And there's a reason for that. And I want to get into this idea of diversity and complexity in just a moment to help contextualize what I'm about to say even further. But before the time that I'm going to start talking about, there were other Native people here. And that means that indigenous people, or people who have at least passed through this area we call Kansas today, represents a history that goes back thousands and thousands of years. That is something I can't really adequately cover in 30 or 40 minutes, because I do want to leave time for questions. But there's another reason. As this slideshow unfolds a little bit, even though many of the things I'm going to say pertain to the past, I really want you to think about the fact that Native people are still here. These are not people who are part of a dead past history. So those living descendants of even the most ancient residents or people who populated Kansas in one way or another, they're still around. And where I teach at Haskell Indian Nations University, which is an all-Native university, I have the privilege of interacting with those descendants all the time. So I want you to keep that in mind. So the talk, diversity and complexity, I just want to say a little bit about those two words. Diversity, because, as I already mentioned, there have been lots and lots of Native American folks here through the history of Kansas, way before anybody ever thought about calling it Kansas. And they did lots of different things. You know, Andy mentioned some of that in her introduction. And also complexity, because I think there has been a tendency, it was true when I went to school, so I'm guessing it's probably true of many of you, that Native people and cultures were kind of given short shrift, that they were judged to be, perhaps noble, or that there were some things that were likable about their cultures, but that their cultures were simple in comparison to Western ways of doing things. And I think that's a long-standing bias. So I really want to focus on complexity as well, because all of the things that we think of as markers of complex cultures, Native people had those too. They did things in different ways sometimes, certainly. But I want to focus then on the fact that there are a range of different people and that they were doing things that were anything but simple, okay? So I'll move on from there into the slides, and I'll work through them, and I'll leave time for questions, as I said, at the end. So when you think about Native people in Kansas, I don't want to assume, but I'm going to. I think most people, when they close their eyes and they hear those words, they probably conjure up something like this, right? So you got these kind of, regal but perhaps primitive-looking hunters out on the plains pursuing buffalo on horseback. All we're really missing is a teepee in the background somewhere. And while those things are somewhat true, yes, the importance of the buffalo, the importance of the horse, the importance of hunting, bow and arrow, it really belies a more complex picture. And so, while that isn't wrong, it is maybe not the full story. So let's dive in and look at some of the groups that have been in Kansas, both prior to and after the arrival of Europeans. This is a map, and I say a map because it's not the only one. There could be different interpretations. But this is a map that probably fairly accurately shows the major groups, the names that we know them by today, who were in Kansas at or about the time of the arrival of outsiders, of non-native people. And as I mentioned, we could probably look at an older map and think about those people who even preceded these groups. Those would be people that archaeologists like to refer to as Paleo-Indians, or sometimes archaic Indians. I'm not an archaeologist, and I'm really not that wild about those names. They come with some baggage, I think. But suffice it to say, there are people who were here even before this map, where I'm going to start. And mostly they have been characterized by their language groups. As you know, archaeologists and anthropologists often focus on artifacts of culture and other markers like language. And while the program, the series that I am part of, has that word artifacts in there, and I want to recognize their importance, again, I want to kind of focus on the living cultures. And each of these groups are ones that we recognize today as living tribal cultures and nations. So over on your left, ranging in the western parts of today's Kansas, would be the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, Kiowas, Comanches up to the north, and these borders are not neatly defined by the modern borders of Kansas, even though the map might kind of indicate that. Up to the north would be the Pawnees, and they're very prevalent up into what's Nebraska today. And over on your right-hand side in the east, the Kansas, or the Kaw Indians, and the Osage. And again, it's not as cut and dried as that. These people didn't, for instance, say, okay, this is our border, this is where we are. That's being contoured by modern interpretations, but it captures some of the key groups who would have been here around the time that Europeans first came. And I want to start with the Kaw people, the Kansas, because that's where the state derives its name, right? Kansas, the Kansas people. That means in their own language, people of the South Wind. And most native groups that we think of today, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of them, we have come to know through names that were not those that they gave to themselves. In other words, they are names that have been imposed by outsiders through the history of contact and colonization and other things like that. The Kaw people, and you see their modern seal, an adaptation to kind of Western ways of doing things, would have been primarily located around the area of Topeka and what's now Council Grove. That became the area of their reservation in the 19th century, and they reside today in what's now Oklahoma. So here are some pictures that give a little bit of the history of the Kaw people. And you see them in those top two photographs in very fine regalia as they visited Washington, D.C. As a diplomatic delegation. And while their clothing and amulets and other things may be different than what we are accustomed to seeing European delegations wearing, they do indicate a political savvy and understanding and complexity. You can see, for instance, in the photo on the left, especially more of kind of an integration of Western styles of dress, and that happened naturally through greater contact with outsiders. But the point I'm trying to make here, these are people who had their own political systems, their own legal systems, their own government structures, and all of those things that make for complexity in their communities and societies, even though their appearance might look a little bit different. And on the bottom, those two photographs show the renovated mission that was set up to minister to the native people, whom the new folks called Kaw. Has anybody ever been to the Kaw mission over in Council Grove? They've just redone it, and it's nice, and they've put in language into the forgive me, I'm not thinking of the proper terms that museums use, but the cards that explain what you're looking at. They've kind of adjusted that so that it's less a history from the missionary point of view and one that's inclusive of Native people. This was established very early, and there are a lot of missions, Christian missions, that were set up in Kansas with the idea of, on some level, changing Native people. And maybe not just through religious conversion, but through introducing ideas about perhaps agriculture or industry or community relations or land. And again, trying to do those things presupposes that Native people didn't have their own way of doing them or have their own concepts of land or education or religion or things like that. So I think that the updated version of the Kaw mission tells a story that's a little bit more balanced than maybe it had in the past, and I'd encourage you to go over and look at it. By the way, the Kaws weren't terribly excited about the mission that was set up for them. They didn't think a whole lot of it. They kind of had their own ways of thinking, and they weren't really interested in listening to stories from the Bible, except maybe sometimes they could relate to them. But they liked the food pretty well, so they did show up there, and they would send some children there, but they had concerns about that too. The other one, or another one that got mentioned in the introduction today, with the land acknowledgement, would be the Osage people who call themselves descendants of the Middle Waters, or water people. And the Osage are a very, very large group, much more so in comparison to the Kaw or Kansas Indians. And we've got a couple of maps there that give you some sense of the areas that they inhabited. So it's not just Kansas. I mean, you can see what's now Missouri and Oklahoma and Arkansas and Texas and even into Louisiana. Osage Indians are sometimes called Imperial Indians, and the Comanches too, because they controlled a very, very large swath of territory. And it was, I don't know that an empire is the exactly right way to describe it, but they did have a very long reach into a lot of different places, and they had a very complex centralized government structure. And that included that within the territories that they controlled, they sort of allowed other groups to maintain their own ways of doing things, but they exacted some tribute. So in that sense, maybe it looks to Westernize like something of an empire. And that, of course, gets whittled away more and more and more until eventually the Osage are confined really to areas of Kansas and now today in Oklahoma. And again, some representations, both a photograph and an artistic interpretation of the Osage people. They also have a very complex spiritual belief system. And that's, of course, true of all of the groups that I'm going to talk about. Different than the mostly Christian religion that the new people who came brought. But sometimes there were ways, I think, that Native people mediated that, and they could understand the belief systems. And, of course, some of them did adopt either in part or in whole aspects of Christianity, just like they did aspects of Western appearance, as you saw with the Kaw delegation a moment ago. The Pawnees, that would be the group on the map that were kind of in the middle, northern portion of what's the state today, made up of 4 major bands, and the Kitahaki are the ones that are most prevalent in the Kansas area. And what you have there on those slides are, again, I think a really cool artistic interpretation of these Pawnee hunters trying to sneak up on buffalo disguised as wolves. I never really understood why the buffaloes would kind of be not at least partially threatened by wolves. They seem to have a very mystified look on their face. But it's art, so open to interpretation. Just like the Kaw and the Osage, buffalo are of central importance in this area of the North American continent. And that is the primary large animal from which a lot of the economies of Kansas Indians are fixated on. There are others, of course, deer and antelope playing out here, I suppose, and ground animals and birds and fish and things like that. But the buffalo, going back to that very first slide, they are important. They're important to nearly all of the groups that I'm going to talk about today. They're not the only aspects of their economies, however. And so with the Pawnees, that's especially true because really primarily they were farmers. And I think that's something that gets missed. And thank you, Andy, for mentioning that in the introduction, because I think, again, going back to that first slide with the Indians hunting buffalo, that we miss that point sometimes. The buffalo is important to those economies, but it's not the only part of those economies. And the Pawnees, being farmers, that means they live in fixed villages. And they will move those villages from time to time because they were smart horticulturalists, and they knew that after a while, the land is going to be kind of depleted of the nutrients of the soil, so they would move their villages and let that land lie fallow for a while, and then pick up and go to a new place. The image on the right, you all heard this probably going back to grade school, at least I know I did, that the Indians weren't wasteful, and they used, everything they could from a given resource. And so, you see this little chart, and it's pointing to all the different parts of the buffalo that they utilized, not just for food, but also for shelter and clothing and tools and medicines and ceremonial uses. What maybe we didn't hear in learning about the relationship with the buffalo is that there was a very spiritual relationship there as well. And that's also not really on the chart, although it makes some reference to things that would be used in religious ceremonies, for instance, the skull. But, that is a key difference, I think, that maybe we have not always focused on. And again, it indicates that there's this spiritual complexity. So the buffalo is seen, yes, as a resource, as something to be utilized, but not simply a resource to be utilized, but instead one where there is a familial relationship, a relationship where the buffalo is seen as a relative who is providing all of those things. And so there are a lot of spiritual recognitions of the sacrifice that buffaloes make that are integrated into the worldview of Native people. So the Pawnees, they also hunt buffaloes, and that's why I put them there. They did semi-annual hunts, but because they're village farmers, they're for the most part sedentary. That happens to make them easy prey for a lot of the other Native people who are out here, because there's a lot of internecine warfare. There's a lot of intertribal warfare that's taking place. Warfare is not something new that Europeans introduce. There's a lot of conflict that's happening between tribal groups way before new people get out here. And the Pawnees, they make excellent trading partners because they can provide things like corn and beans and squash and other things to those more nomadic groups, but it also makes them kind of a target because they're living in villages where they can easily be attacked. I wanted to just telescope in a tiny bit further into the kind of metaphysical, or I'll use a fancy college professor word, epistemological thinking of the Pawnees. They believed, just as they had a relationship with the buffalo here on Earth, that they had a very familial connection with the universe around them, and that included the stars. They saw themselves as being descendants of the stars, and they would arrange their villages to reflect that relationship. And it's a very hierarchical society, and we might think of Native groups as being somewhat egalitarian, which is not wholly false. But for the Pawnees, it is a very kind of rigid, stratified social structure that they have. So the people who, for instance, are known to be descendants of key stars, or the morning star, for instance, they had more status in the society. And what you're seeing on the left there is a depiction of their star knowledge, or what we would call astronomy. So these are people who exhibit complexity in terms of their scientific knowledge as well. And this is probably buffalo, but could be deer hide that it has the English translations of what it's depicting, but it is a reflection. It's like a star map, basically, something that they were able to observe without the aid of telescope. And when you look at the astronomical knowledge of Native people, it's pretty impressive sometimes. It's like, how did they know these things because some of them were beyond what you can see with the naked eye. And then over on the right, I just put kind of the prototypical Pawnee male warrior. They have that very distinct hairstyle, kind of maybe what we would think of like a mohawk. And then I want to talk about the Cheyennes and Arapahoes, and remember these are the ones kind of in the northwest area of what's today Kansas. They're very closely allied groups. They're culturally distinct, but they are often found working and camping and cooperating together. These are groups who are nomadic. They rely on the buffalo as their principal source of economic output and enjoyment. And so these would be some of the ones who are at war with the Pawnees over perhaps resource or land use, but also, again, because they're roving bands, small groups, and the Pawnees are larger groups in fixed villages. There are subdivisions to the Cheyenne and Arapaho, so we're talking about southern Cheyenne and southern Arapaho in Kansas. And then up in the northern plains are where the northern groups would have been centered. But they come together a couple times a year for key ceremonies. What happens in the mid-19th century, though, as the Transcontinental Railroad is built, it kind of divides those tribes, just like it divided the buffalo herds. On which most of them relied. And then just a little bit more about them. When we go back to that original map I showed you, a lot of these groups are not really indigenous to Kansas. They come later. And that applies to the Cheyennes and Arapahoes because originally, they would have been located around the area of Minnesota, and they kind of migrate over into some of the other parts of what we used to call the Old Northwest. And then they wind up on the plains. And part of that is because of the introduction of the horse. Because thinking back to that artist's rendering of the Indians hunting buffalo on horseback, the horse is not something that Native people had before the arrival of Europeans. There was a horse that was here millennia ago, but it was a little tiny thing. It wasn't like the horse we think of today. So with the introduction of horses from Europeans, that did have a rather watershed effect on Native peoples, and it allowed some of them, including these groups, to move out into the plains to pursue those buffalo herds. You've all heard of the Battle of Little Bighorn, presumably, and we know that that's where the Sioux, the Lakota, defeated Custer and the 7th Cavalry and the famous or infamous Last Stand. Cheyenne and Arapaho were there as well. They were allying themselves with that coalition. And then we get to the Kiowas and Comanches, and again, back to that early map over on the left-hand, southwestern part of West Kansas. These groups, same thing. Culturally distinct, but closely allied. And the Comanches are a very large group. Kiowas are very small. And the Kiowas have a very interesting history all their own as they move around to different places, but eventually wind up kind of in the sphere of influence of the Comanches. They, too, are ranging out into western Kansas and eastern Colorado. These would be that other group that sometimes historians call Imperial Indians. Not sure I love the term, but it does make a certain amount of sense when we think about the great territorial expanse that they control. And they are known as master horsemen and as a very fierce opponent in battle, both among Indian groups and then when later people come. I wanted to mention the Treaty of Medicine Lodge because it's another connection to Kansas, and it's a connection to those Kansas Indians, Kiowas, Comanches, Kiowa Apaches, which is a distinct group, and then the Cheyennes. This is one of the last treaties. It's actually a series of treaties that get negotiated between the United States government and Native nations. After 1871, there are no treaties. So it's an important one. And it's all about trying to settle the issue of defining the boundaries of emerging territories in the United States and how they're going to configure that in terms of the Indians who are already there. I think probably the most important outcome is that, as with most of those tribes, really all of them that you saw on that early map, it's going to determine where they wind up. And so I want to move to this map. By the middle, let's say that first one was about 1,500, 1,600, 1,700. This is what Kansas Indian Territory looks like a few hundred years later, by the middle of the 19th century. And, it might not be easy for you to see it in the back of the writing. It's kind of small. But are there any obvious differences you notice? Several. One, straight lines, Western conceptions of defining territorial boundaries, right? Not those native ones. Sometimes my students will invoke this phrase, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's kind of what you see happening here. Another difference is that, with very little exception, the Osage being one, there really isn't any representation of those groups from that first map here. So it looks really different in terms of the indigenous population, or really indigenous is misleading, of the presence of those people who come to be called American Indians, Native Americans. The Kansa would be another exception. You can see the Osage and the Kansa have a fairly relatively sizable piece of land set aside for them. This is the outcome of treaties, for one thing, that establish these boundaries. It's also the outcome of another phenomenon, which is removal of Indians from the east. Everybody's probably heard of the Trail of Tears, the removal of Indians from the southeast, the Cherokees, Choctaws, Chickasaws, etc. But removal is happening in other places and in other ways as well. And sometimes it's not a legal process so much as just something that occurs as more and more new people are pushing in from the east. It drives Native groups to new places, and as they're decimated by disease and internal divisions and things like that, they often wind up in different places from where they originated. And Kansas is a really powerful example of that. So there are, for the most part on this map, people who come from very far away. Those folks like the Shawnees, and if you ever go to Kansas City, you see like Shawnee Mission all over the place. They're from the Ohio Valley. Chippewas are really Ojibwas. Those are Great Lakes people. Same with the Ottawas or Odawas. And you see a big strip in there of New York Indian lands. What in the heck are Indians from New York doing out in Kansas? And so it's changed quite dramatically in just a few hundred years. And part of that is the push to settle new territories, and of course, that means that a lot of the lands that previously were occupied by Native people are now occupied by somebody different, and so you see this kind of pattern develop where Native people from a long ways away wind up, in kind of the middle of the developing nation. I wanted to give a plug to Haskell because that's where I'm from. Haskell is commemorating its 140th year of continuous operation. We are today, of course, a university offering degrees in many different areas, but we started off as a boarding school that was meant to strip away American Indian cultures. It was meant to assimilate Native people, and so I just included a few older shots of the time when it was called Haskell Institute. And the reason I wanted to do this is, well, because Haskell's near and dear to my heart, for one, but because Haskell is a place that brings many, many, many new and different Native people to Kansas, where a number of them remain. So by the 1890s, Haskell's established in 1884. By the 1890s, you have students from as far away as California and Alaska. So Kansas is being populated by new groups of Native people, some of whom will remain. I mean, Lawrence and Kansas City area has a very large Native American population, and Wichita too, to a lesser extent. As the school evolves over that 140 years, it's bringing in greater and greater numbers of Native people and greater and greater representation of different tribal groups. So I think it's important in thinking about the development of Indian Kansas to include that. Today at Haskell Indian Nations University, we regularly have 140, 150 different tribal nations represented. So if you think back to that idea of diversity, I mean, that's pretty diverse. We only have about 1,000 students, so it's small. We live in the shadow of KU, right up the hill, who likes to tout its diversity, but I mean, I think that's a pretty amazing comparison point for us. And then I kind of want to wind down and leave some time for questions. This historical marker that maybe some of you have seen is dedicated to several of the things that I've talked about. Although it kind of begins with Plymouth Rock, the idea is that European settlement or resettlement of Indian lands, pushed a number of indigenous groups out into the West through that treaty-making process, or sometimes just through kind of the cataclysm of what was happening in the 19th century through warfare and removal and stuff. It changes the landscape of Kansas. So, that map there, most of the Indians you see are what historians would refer to as immigrant Indians. And I think that might fit in, too, with the theme of this series about immigrants, because what would it be like to come from the Great Lakes or to come from New York and be faced with the landscape here? Just as other groups came in and had to make some pretty strong and hard adjustments to what they found around them environmentally. So this is also, giving some testimony to what happened with the immigration to new places. And it also recognizes, like the land acknowledgement at the beginning, some of the people who were here before, and also the 4 remaining Native groups who have reservations in Kansas, most of them kind of in the northeastern part of the state. So the Kickapoos, Sac and Fox, Iowas, and Prairie Band Potawatomis. And I'm from Citizen Potawatomi. It used to be called Citizen Band Potawatomi. So we were part of that group. We were here in Kansas for a while, and we split off because we took citizenship, U.S. citizenship, very early. And so those migration patterns represent within Indian communities, some pretty big changes as well in kind of how we thought about ourselves. And, if you get nothing else out of today, somebody says, oh, there are Indian reservations in Kansas, and you tell them, yeah, there are 4 of them here. Like, how did they get to be here? Well, none of them were here originally. None of those groups are original natives to this area. They came from someplace else. So it's part of that larger history of diversity and complexity, and Kansas, I think, is well situated to represent those things. All of those aspects, and I know I covered them very briefly. It's hard to do justice to these things in a short amount of time, but economies, governments, laws, religion, artistic expression, all of those things that we see as markers of culture, complex culture, Native people had. And Kansas has been a crossroads for many, many different people. That includes Native people, as well as those who come later. So what I like to do at the end of my presentations, because I give this presentation in kind of a static way, I guess you could say. I mean, I'm always just sort of, speaking extemporaneously, but I like to kind of drill down on the area where I am. So is there a group of people that you think I might have missed here? Thinking about your large metropolitan neighbor over here. Yeah, I mean Wichita. Yeah. I didn't mention the Wichita Indians. I think Andy said something about them in the land acknowledgement. Wichita Indians, it's not really just one tribe. It's a group of different tribes, and that's what you're seeing on the map and kind of a distribution. So they are actually a confederacy, and that's true of some of the other Indian groups who have been here. The Potawatomis, the Ottawas, and the Ojibwas are a confederacy called the Council of Three Fires. Wichita people are a confederacy, again, showing complexity politically in conjoining culturally similar but distinct groups of people. They are tied together by a common language, which, big surprise, is now called the Wichita language, but is a Caddoan language. So if you wanted to zoom back beyond the telescope where I started at the beginning and think about those archaeological constructions, Caddoan and Siouan peoples who are in this area refers to their language stock. And you see Kansas up there, and it says before 1720, because really the migration of the Wichitas happens pretty early. So around the time of that very first map I was showing you, they're already kind of starting to fade out of the picture and move into places further south. They were, however, encountered by Coronado, or maybe I should say, the Wichitas encountered this group of wandering Spaniards who were out here in what's called, again, by archaeologists, the Great Bend aspect. This bend of the river along which their communities existed. So they were out here. There's sometimes the ones that we hear referred to as Queberans in that ever ongoing saga in the search for gold by the Spanish. They found they didn't have any, so they moved on. And the teepee, this is not a teepee, and teepees are not the kind of houses that all Kansas Indians lived in. I didn't put any other slides in here to show you, but with the Osage, they used what's called round houses, and just as the name suggests, they're round houses. Constructed out of wood, probably, with some earthen material to hold them together. With the Pawnees, they live in earth lodges, dug into the earth, and Wichitas live in these grass houses. So they kind of are relying on the environment in which they are most closely associated. And with the new people who come out, say from New York or other places, they brought their longhouses. So not all Indians live in teepees, so even their housing structures represent a type of diversity and complexity, we could say. And then just to finish up, we're thinking about some of those other groups, and a few were mentioned in the land acknowledgement at the beginning, but the Kiowas, the Comanches, the Osage, and also Siouan peoples would have been either native to or proximal to the area that we are in right now. So with that, I will conclude and see if you have questions or comments that you would like to make. Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here.
I have a microphone.
Okay. We'll do it like the old Phil Donahue show.
Thank you for being here this afternoon. Much appreciated. Two questions. One is, what is the source of information over the generations? Was, by my understanding of the word, written language. Did that occur? And secondly, what is the origin of the word Haskell for your institution?
So I assume you mean in terms of how information has been conveyed or passed down among Native people. So they would not have had what we think of as a written language system like English. Of course, that comes to them later, and they're going to make strides to adapt or integrate that. But they used other systems of writing and symbols, which would vary from tribe to tribe. That means that information is conveyed orally, right? The oral tradition. And I just want to say quickly about that. We could probably do a whole lecture just on that. But again, there's been a lot of bias, I think, by people who do have written languages that oral testimony or oral tradition is unreliable. And I would push back against that. I think it's been and tangibly recognized that there's pretty strong consistency in terms of how information, such as spiritual beliefs or customs or stories or histories, have been conveyed over time. Of course, there are disruptions to that have occurred through all of the things that were happening out here. And also, there's going to be some malleability to conveying word or information orally, but that's also true of the written word. I mean, that doesn't stay static either. So historians are finding out new things all the time that changes the way we have looked at things in the past. So that would be the thumbnail answer to that. And then Haskell is named for this guy, Dudley C. Haskell, who has really nothing to do with Native Americans, except for the fact that he was the chairman of the House Committee on Indian Affairs, who happened to steer a large congressional appropriation into these schools that were designed to assimilate Indians. And being a good politician, he sent one to his home district. So my students still are often surprised to find that their university is named for a white guy.
Other questions?
We have one over here.
A lot of the recent archaeological work down in the Ark City area,
Uh-huh.
were those Osage?
This is the work primarily of Donald Blakesley. At least I know he was spearheading a lot of that. He's, I think, emeritus now professor at WSU. These are people who probably have, I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to speak incorrectly. These are people who I think shared some cultural ties with those Quaviran people, so-called Quaviran people. So the ones we think of as Wichitas, but what has been discovered out there around Ark City are very huge, not only encampments, but essentially what you think of as kind of industrial processing centers for buffalo, which again speaks to that complexity. It's probably something I should think about including in this presentation. That's not the exact right terminology, but I think that's a way we could understand it. So that certain people are acting as middlemen in a very vibrant economy of trade that's happening. So that that particular group of people, in my understanding, would be most closely related to them, but there would have been all kinds of activity happening relating to the economic pulse that was beating there.
Other questions?
I'm curious about the map that had all the different mini reservations on it. Maybe you might call it that. Balkanization
Yeah.
of internally displaced people.
Mm-hmm.
How did they manage those? I mean, it must have been an administrative nightmare to try to manage that. And somebody, somebody doesn't say, well, I have a passport for the Saxon foxes of
Right.
Mississippi. I mean,
Right, right.
so how did they even conceive of this?
It's a great question. I think it's very hodgepodge in its development. You have Native people who are being displaced and moved out here by the 1830s. And what begins as maybe a drip turns into a trickle, turns into a flood. There are a number of different commissioners of Indian Affairs who are overseeing that process in conjunction with a place that more and more outsiders, more and more new people, non-native people are arriving who are clamoring for the resources that Indians have been given out here, because originally this would have been conceived as a permanent Indian territory. And now we know, looking at this map and knowing that there are only 4 reservations left, most of those folks are pushed on somewhere else too, so it's not permanent. But yeah, I think it was an administrative nightmare. Whether the Euro-American politicians or administrators who change with time are allowing themselves to be influenced by corporate interests like railroads and mining operations and things like that. That also is going to have a hand in how these places are managed, because Indians who move out into Kansas are from very environmentally different places and are dealing with those kinds of things they need to adapt to, are also constantly making complaints about, the railroads making promises to set up town sites, and that's just bringing people in who are encroaching on reservation lands, and squatters are coming in and invoking squatters' rights to be able to get their hands on resources, timber, mineral wealth, et cetera. So, I mean, you're very astute to notice that, yes, it's a very loosely regulated kind of system. And while there is on paper kind of an overarching official, that changes with presidential administrations. And if we're looking at a period of maybe 50-ish years over which this develops and then gets totally remade again, it's not very consistent then how things are applied. Yeah.
Is there any evidence currently observable of any of these nomadic villages?
Yeah, and again, I'm not an archaeologist, so it's not my specialty, but certainly Kansas sites, Cheyenne sites. So looking back into the even earlier record, definitely evidence of those early Caddoan peoples, the impression that they left on the earth in their village sites and other things. But yeah, it's a little out of my wheelhouse, but yes, I think to just basically answer the question, yeah, there are a number of them.
I have a question that came in from a museum colleague who knew this presentation was going to happen, so I'm going to just read that. And she had recently read an article out of Canada, and this is a quote from the article that she read, and then she references it in the question. The land of the East Reserve is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe who traversed the land for hunting and ceremony. And the focus there is really ceremony, and it actually kind of ties into your question over there. Considering the land is integral to ceremony leads to the following question. Many of us know that the Black Hills are sacred ground to the Dakota and Lakota nations. Some of us have visited the Serpent Mound in Rice County near Lyons. That undoubtedly was sacred to the ancestors of the Wichita people. Are there other locations in Kansas acknowledged to have been the site of ceremonies for First Nations?
Yeah, but I'm not going to tell you where they are. No, just kidding. This is an issue, though. I mean, I think places that are deemed to be sacred in and of themselves are more often than not sacred for a specific reason. In other words, it's marking something that happened there. Whether that's tied to an origin story, or whether that's tied to a particular historical period, or something else. So I would approach this by saying, think again about the layering of different Native groups who have been here. I will mention one, but with time, there's going to be a sacredness ascribed to different places, even if people are relatively new. Because they're kind of carrying their nation with them as they immigrate, which is true of all immigrants to a certain extent. So how they then reconfigure their own spiritual beliefs and ceremony, even if it looks a lot different environmentally, I think it is a phenomenon that we can count on, right? But I was thinking for the Osage people in particular, kind of going back to that first set of Native people. Their spiritual belief system is centered on this idea of a spiritual force that they call Wakanda. And there's a place that is now called Wakanda Lake, and it's a reservoir out in western Kansas, but it used to be a natural spring. And that's where they had a lot of their sacred ceremonies, in this part of the country. And again, I think they're a large territorial expanse that they have, so it's not their only sacred place. But it doesn't exist now in the way that it did then. And later it became like a kind of a medicinal springs destination spot. But then it got covered up by this reservoir. But yes, certain places like that, they maybe see the life force, flowing from a place like that. Just as it was mentioned, the Black Hills are sacred to the Lakota, even though they're relatively late arrivals to that area. So I want to reinforce that idea that I think people carry the idea of sacredness with them. For Native people, the practice is in what's sometimes referred to as land-based theology. So place is central to spirituality, and I guess that does maybe, in a positive way, allow them to rekindle those things in new places. I would also say, with regard to that Wakanda Springs, it's really interesting because even among all the intertribal warfare that was taking place, that was part of what was recognized as Osage territory, but because Kansas doesn't really have a lot of natural water systems other than rivers, not a lot of lakes and things like that, the Osage made no obstacle to other tribes coming in to access that water, recognizing everyone has to have it to survive. So yeah, there are probably a number of sacred sites that we could point to. That would be one that I can think of and kind of safely point to without being, an expert on the religious beliefs and customs of all of these different groups.
Thank you. And not seeing any more immediate questions, I think, are you willing to stay for other individual questions if people want to come up? All right, well,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Okay.
We appreciate you being
Of
here
course.
today.
Thank you.